what he does do really well is his turnover generation. This guy is a turnover generating monster, I would venture to say. And in my opinion, that's why the metrics love him so much, because turnovers are so significant in terms of their impact on the game. He constantly gets in passing lanes, tons of deflections. And this is interesting as far as like a metric on Delon Wright. He's actually been in the top 90th percentile in B-Ball Index's defensive playmaking metric from 2017 through now. So he's been in the top 90th percentile in defensive playmaking from 2017 through 2025. This is Hot Hand Theory. This is a podcast where we talk about the NBA and break things down from an analytical perspective. I'm your co-host, XJ. As always, I am joined by my brilliant co-host, Geoff. Geoff, we have a ton to talk about with the Knicks for this one. The Knicks they had some trade deadline activity, a little bit of something, I would say. And that's just one thing that we're going to cover because we haven't been on in a little while. And we have a backed up, maybe some backed up rants that we need to get out potentially, but a lot that we need to talk about. OG Anunoby's injury, how the Knicks have approached the vacuum that he's left. But really, all in all, the Knicks quietly having won still 7 of their last 8. I think we should just jump right into it. Let's talk about the trade deadline. It came and went. The Knicks were relatively quiet. They did send out Jericho Sims. I think Ariel Hukporty's performance has pretty much made him expendable, as well as the impending return of Mitchell Robinson. And that was part of a deal that brought in Delon Wright. So first, starting at the top, Geoff, what are your thoughts about Jericho out, Wright in? And then, we can talk about what the Knicks could have been looking to do at the deadline and whether it's cool that they really didn't do much of anything besides acquiring Delon Wright, who we'll break down as a player as well.
Yeah, I always liked Delon Wright. I assume you did too, just because he's always been one of those low-key analytics darlings, like per minute, the impact dad always liked him. And then you watch the tape whenever he gets on the court. He's one of those guys that you assume something has to be missing with the stuff we're not seeing because the data almost so consistently is so consistent in liking him that it begs the question why he's never played more for teams he's been on. But regardless, to the point you made, Sims was not going to play now and probably not in the future with the emergence of Hukporty. He played too well against Toronto and is just with how Thibodeau wants the center position to be used in the present with no OG Anunoby and him not wanting Precious Achiuwa to be that center because he doesn't have OG Anunoby's secondary rim protection there. It's going to be Hukporty Hukporty cemented that role. So yeah, Sims was pretty much, I don't want to say useless, but he just wasn't going to be a part of the rotation, and replacing that with a more veteran guy who, could see some minutes and is competent in the minutes he will see. I think that's a fine move by the Knicks. I understand there are some fans out there who may be a little underwhelmed by that being the only thing that the Knicks get, and we'll talk about that in a second here. But as far as this trade in isolation, I think it's a good one for the Knicks.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think Delon Wright is a guy, if we just focus on him for a second, I think he's a guy who was very interesting to me last year for the Knicks in particular, when he ended up going to Miami. And the reason for that is that he is a very strong perimeter defender, which really fits right in with what the Knicks want to do, obviously. And historically, he can offer you at least a little bit of spacing from the guard position. He's a career 35% three-point shooter, but has been better than that towards the latter half of his career. He's getting up there in age. I think he's approaching 33 now. But the thing I love about his defense specifically and why I think he's so much of a better fit than Sims on the roster moving forward is because he's not like, a take the best offensive guard on the opponent and lock them down on the perimeter guy necessarily. But what he does do really well is his turnover generation. Like, this guy is a turnover generating monster, I would venture to say. And in my opinion, that's why the metrics love him so much because turnovers are so significant in terms of their impact on the game, ending the opponent's possession, starting a new possession from an advantageous position for the offense. He constantly gets in passing lanes, tons of deflections, sort of that Oklahoma City style defense where, they're literally proactively trying to generate turnovers. Great anticipation about where the ball is going and when. And this is interesting as far as like a metric on Delon Wright. He's actually been in the top 90th percentile in B-Ball Index's defensive playmaking metric. And that's a metric that looks at impactful defensive plays like deflections, charges drawn, steals, and blocks. So kind of like, the defensive plays that make noise, so to speak, from 2017 through now. So he's been in the top 90th percentile in defensive playmaking from 2017 through 2025. That's incredible. Obviously, he doesn't play a ton of minutes and has been a bit of a journeyman, but he has always consistently brought that ability to turn you over and play really solid defense on the perimeter. So I think that it's a much better fit than Jericho, who, like you said, wasn't going to play much, if at all, probably would require multiple injuries to play even a reasonable number of minutes. So wasn't going to get much burn on the team. Delon Wright's a better fit. And I think for the sake of the rotation, if there are continue to be injuries or guys get hurt or, until Mitchell Robinson comes back, I think Landry Shamet is probably the odd man out for Delon Wright is probably what I would expect. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, Shamet is definitely the odd man out. He's just hasn't done much with the minutes he's been given. We can, at some point, I'm sure we can talk about why that may be. I still contend that it's extremely unlikely that Landry Shamet just forgot how to play basketball or forgot how to shoot the basketball. So I do think there are driving factors there that perhaps are out of his control. But the fact of the matter is that's irrelevant. He was given whatever opportunity he was given, he has not succeeded with. And it would not surprise me at all if Delon Wright is given an opportunity in his place. He can fill in next to, a Deuce McBride. He's a little bit bigger as a guard. He's 6'5". And to XJ's point, he's been in the 93rd percentile or better in steal percentage like every year of his career. So he brings something a little bit different off of a guy like Deuce McBride off the bench. I think they'd be a nice tandem. And yeah, I expect him to get an opportunity. But more than anything, XJ, I think what this trade deadline has told me is it's just reinforced something that we've been purporting for months now. And that's that the front office is very comfortable with this team and they believe in this version of the team. They didn't think that, in spite of what the fan base might perceive as certain struggles against really good teams, they don't think that it's a roster construction issue. They think this roster on its own merits can contend, and they should feel that way, as we've said over and over again. So I think that they're just going to bet on this continuity that they've built throughout the season. They're going to view Mitchell Robinson returning as a sort of an acquisition. And I don't know if I can make the point any clearer. I think that the front office is saying we've constructed a contender. Now go contend.
Yeah, I generally agree with you. I do have some caveats and I have some speculation here. So for our audience, I'm going to, we do a lot of objective talk and then we do a lot of data talk and then we have some speculation and some opinions and we mix it all in. This is the pure speculation aspect of the program. So I think that maybe they thought there could be some improvements to the roster, but I think they're sort of, I wouldn't say desperation, but their urgency for addressing some issues with the roster potentially have been sort of assuaged by the fact of what we've seen kind of happen recently with OG Anunoby's injury and missing games. I think that in how I'm thinking through the Knicks thinking, I believe that Thibs really loves and is starting to fall in love with potentially Towns next to a traditional big. And I think we've seen from, the Towns and Precious pairing, it's been plus 10.8 per 100 over 468 possessions as a tandem. And the offense has been really good. And then the Towns and Huck-Porty combination that they've been running out of late, it's been incredible over a very, 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 very small handful of possessions. But I believe that has really emboldened Thibs, in my opinion. And I think that we as fans and analysts, the fans of the team, us as analysts, like know that Thibs' preference is to have a traditional big on the court and beat teams up on the boards on both sides. And I think as humans, all of us, and you and I were kind of talking about this a little bit before we jumped on the pod, we sort of oftentimes require less confirming evidence to confirm what our intuition is, to believe in that. Whereas we need a ton of evidence disconfirming our intuition to stop believing it. And so I think for Thibs, this around 500-ish possessions of lineup data that where there's a big next to Towns and that doing really well in that amount of sample is probably enough for him to be really salivating at the idea of Mitchell Robinson coming back to play next to Karl-Anthony Towns. And so my opinion, my speculation is sort of like, maybe they would be like, maybe we need to make a move. This is not working perfectly with Karl-Anthony Towns at the 5. But I believe that they're going to run out Karl-Anthony Towns as primarily a power forward. And before I pass it to you after saying that, recall that my prediction at the beginning of the season, right after the trade, was when everybody was like, Karl-Anthony Towns at the 5, this is amazing, the spacing. I was like, hang on. I think when Mitchell Robinson is back, Karl-Anthony Towns is going to be a power forward, is going to be a 4, primarily next to Mitch. And I would not be surprised if it happens. I could imagine it not happening because of how well Josh Hart has played. I think there's probably no chance Josh Hart goes to the bench. But I do think we're going to see a ton of Josh Hart, Karl-Anthony Towns, and Mitch all together when Mitch is back. I think we'll see a ton of Towns and Mitch together. And I think we'll see a ton of Towns next to Precious. I think it'll either be Towns next to Precious or Towns next to Mitch. And there's a solid chance we rarely see Towns at the 5 almost at all. And that's kind of what I'm thinking based on the small sample results that we've seen. The Knicks' approach to the deadline with not really a ton of urgency, with Mitchell Robinson coming back, with the lineups that have been deployed. And so those are some of my expectations moving forward. I'm curious what you think about that.
I was going to ask you who you think the odd man out is if it's not Mitch. Excuse me, in those Mitch Towns lineups, because he has to choose. I don't think it can be OG. I don't think it can be Brunson. So I feel like it's going to come down to McCall and Hart. And I'm curious who you think will be the odd man out there.
Well, that's why I think Hart. I think that the regular starting lineup will continue to start. Like, I don't think that's going to necessarily change. I think Hart has played too well, and then it's already confirming what Thibs believes, which is that Hart is a elite player in the NBA, which he's played really well. Like, there's no argument about that. But I just think like how the rotations work, I think we will see a lot more Mitch and Towns, and I think it probably is going to end up being like fewer minutes from OG or fewer minutes from Bridges is probably what's going to happen. That's what I would guess. But yeah, I just believe that to be the case. I mean, we'll definitely see, but I think to me, the evidence lies in how much we are seeing Towns play next to Precious and Towns play next to Huck-Porty, and also even extreme versions of this where like we have, Precious, Huck-Porty and Hart. It's almost so like, this is what I'll say, Geoff, real quick before I hand it back to you. So I think one thing we know is that almost for certain Towns' impact will drop off as a power forward. I think that's effectively a certainty. But how likely is it that actually the overall team performance actually still improves despite Towns' individual impact dropping? Because to me, the biggest tension that has gone back and forth throughout this entire season has been, in terms of the Knicks style and approach, has been, spacing. How much is ideal? How much should they trade the spacing in their lineups for other advantages like better rebounding or rim protection? And the Knicks have yet to really lean into the maximal spacing environment. We this is something we've been asking for. They haven't really done it. They've had a few possessions of it, but they haven't really done it. But they definitely err towards leaning into the maximal rebounding and paint protection environments. And like I said, even explored extreme versions of that with the Precious Heart Huck Porty, which has performed in 20 possessions minus 125 points per 100 possessions. So yes, obviously it's just 20 possessions, but they would be getting outscored 190 to 65 if you extrapolated that to stretch to an average NBA game.
I'm sorry. Can I just?
Yeah.
People, there's a thing that you've been hammering home recently about small sample sizes, and it's like people use small sample sizes, the idea of small sample sizes in arguments only when they are relevant to what they already think is true. So if somebody does something that they don't like, they're all about, oh, well, this small sample size data, it doesn't matter, or it does matter based on what it says. But if they're trying to support it, it's the other way. And in this case, when, I'm sorry, the overwhelming intuitive logic is that this lineup will fail, and then the lineup goes out and fails spectacularly, it almost doesn't matter that it's a small, like, that should just be the end of it. That should just be, there is no argument for the three of those players playing on the court together. Or the arguments are very slim relative to the arguments against those three on the court together. So if somehow intuitively you land on, you know what, I want to give them a try. I want to see, I think Hart can make it work with a couple of shooters. I think he'll change his role, whatever it is. It has to have a shorter leash than other things. So I don't think that the sample size of this lineup, I'm not saying it's totally relevant. I'm not saying that this guarantees failure in the future. They could turn around and have 20 really successful possessions. But I do think that it is somewhat relevant, or more relevant than 20 possessions of data would be in other examples.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is a lot to, and we could almost do a whole pod about sample sizes and all these kinds of ways to, draw conclusions or to make decisions. But I think of small samples oftentimes as sort of like an A/B test. Like if we were testing the effectiveness of an email, we're trying to see how we can increase open rates as much as possible. And we have two different versions of the email. We want to kind of do a pilot. We send out, let's say, 50 emails. Let's say overall we want to send the email out to actually 10,000 people, but we send out 50 of them to a few people. 25 get A, 25 get B, and we just kind of see what happens. Like, that is not a scientific study, and you can't say, well, A destroyed B, and so A is a much better email, let's send them all out as A. Of course not. That doesn't tell you anything. You could have randomly come upon the 25 people who loved whatever you constructed as email A, and that can absolutely happen. And it's more likely to happen the smaller the sample is. But at the same time, when you're trying to make decisions and you don't have the ability to just run, millions of simulations, and you have to make long-term decisions with little information, that information that you get on top of what your intuition says, what we've seen historically, what current, trends are in terms of success and ways that teams are defended and the way that teams play offense, all of these things you take into consideration, and then you add that on top of the small sample to help you make decisions about how you should move forward. So it doesn't mean that this lineup is a minus 125 points per 100 possessions lineup because it performed that way in 20 possessions. In fact, we'd probably need 500 to 700 possessions of the lineup to see it stabilize. But at the same time, your intuition should tell you that this would probably struggle, and then it does over a small sample. It probably is not worthwhile to waste your time continuing to run it out there. Like that is the way that you use small samples to make decisions, in my opinion. So
I was thinking when you brought up the A/B test, it's actually just more extreme than that. Like if you are the person who runs a fire department, and you're trying to figure out the most efficient ways to get from from your station to a certain location, and you take two different directions in a small sample size, the results could just be variance over a small enough sample size and could matter, or it could not matter. But if you're trying to figure out what the best way to put out a fire is, and over a small sample size, water is more effective than gasoline. I don't think you need too many samples to be like, yeah, this gasoline stuff just doesn't work. And to me, that's what that's how extreme this Hart, Precious, Huckporty trio is. Like, it's just, it probably wasn't even worth trying in the first place, but okay, you tried it. It was disastrous. They put themselves in a hole against Houston that they had to dig out of by going to the small lineup with that probably should be the starting lineup, with Deuce in the starting lineup for Precious, or with the starters for Precious. And then they almost lost the Raptors game to a shorthanded Raptors team with quickly limited RJ out, and they closed with like bench/G League players and still almost, pushed them. They cut it to 1 and had the ball with 2 minutes left before Jalen Brunson went superhero mode. And it's a really interesting thing to me because I was watching that Raptors game and I was thinking to myself, man, I think if there's one player in the entire NBA who could raise the offense's floor to passable or good levels in these circumstances, it's Jalen Brunson. And then I just started to think about all the ways that this front office has almost offset Thibs's biggest weaknesses. And it's so interesting to me because you have, he has this obsession with size at the expense of shooting. So you need someone like Jalen Brunson who can create good offense even in a limited spacing environment. Okay, that's one box checked. He loves to play his starters more than probably a coach should love to play his starters. Well, they went and got two of arguably, if not the most durable wings in the entire NBA, guys who in Mikal Bridges and Josh Hart, who can play absolutely insane minutes. And then you go back to the spacing thing where Thibs says, I'm gonna play. I need guys who can check certain boxes, and shooting is not one of those boxes. The front office went out and got a center who is one of the best 3-point shooters in the league, who Thibs would play at center, and allows him to play non-shooters at other positions. It's just interesting to me how actually perfect this roster is suited to Thibodeau's style. And you're telling me now that it still isn't what he imagined or what he wants, and they're going to adjust it against that Mitchell, Robinson, and Towns can play more together. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I just find it all very interesting.
Well, I agree with you, and I think it's perfectly suited for what Thibs wants to do. It's just about how they deploy it, right? Like, I think he's just going to continue to deploy it in the way that he would prefer, which makes sense. He's the coach. And so that's what, when you hire a coach and you say, run my team and make these decisions about like deployment and lineups and all those things, then you would expect him to do what you would expect him to do, which is he's doing it. He's definitely erring towards caring more, in my opinion, caring more about rebounding and paint protection than he is about spacing. And, again, I think that the question is, if it's good, if it's acceptable, will it get by in the regular season, but not in the playoffs? But we also know that this roster is so flexible. Like they're not stuck in any one approach. Like they're lineups that don't include a non or poor shooter. So there are lineups that don't include any of, Precious, Huckporty, Josh Hart. I'm throwing in there, Sims when he's on the team. Any of those guys. There are lineups that don't include any of those guys. So any variety of lineups that don't include non or poor shooters have played only 218 possessions together. That's 218 like maximally spaced out lineups. So it's clearly not a priority. That's all. That's across the entire season. Across those 218 possessions, they're plus 22 points per plus 22 points per 100 possessions. So, they dominate when they play these spacing type lineups. But it's not a priority, and it's not the way that the coaching staff and the organization right now is going to err. It's just not. Like, I think that we have enough evidence to know that. And so to me, it doesn't feel like a leap in logic to assume that when they get another center back, and they already like playing Karl-Anthony Towns next to a center, and that's been relatively successful over a small number of possessions, that they would lean into that even more. And I would say that the interesting thing to me, and you asked about, is it OG or is it Bridges that are going to be the ones to kind of be not phased out, but like lose some of those possessions. That so one of them has to drop, in my opinion. I mean, maybe Hart, but I don't think it's going to be Hart, because if I look at the top played lineups that Jalen Brunson and Karl-Anthony Towns are in it. So Karl-Anthony Towns, Jalen Brunson on, and then we just see who else filters in. The top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those lineups all have Josh Hart. So the top 5 lineups, all with at least 68 possessions or more, that have Towns and Brunson, all include Josh Hart. But some of them don't include OG, and some of them don't include Mikal Bridges. So those are the guys that are going to be reduced in their time, in my opinion, when you're adding Mitchell Robinson to the mix, not Josh Hart. Josh Hart will be in all of these lineups, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't think you can argue with that. And I want to clarify something, because I think I've done a poor job of communicating this aspect of it. First of all, none of these decisions are 100-0 decisions. And I just want to reinforce that over and over again, because sometimes I can be dogmatic or exaggeratory in my speech. But there absolutely are positive trade-offs and merit to these decisions. They're not baseless decisions. But I want to focus on, when XJ and I react to certain decisions that are made, like when Huck Porty is playing with Precious Achiuwa and Josh Hart at the same time, or when certain decisions are made in the Houston game, when it takes 40 minutes of game time to realize that other things need to be emphasized. The reason that these things are so troubling to XJ and I as analysts is because of the heavy correlation between bad decisions or decisions that have specific motivations driving them and future decision making. Like, if you meet someone and they tell you what is motivating them and what is going to drive the decisions they make, it's extremely unlikely that in a month or when things matter more, that's going to change. Those decisions aren't going to, and we don't just have, a week's worth of evidence. We now have 5 seasons worth of evidence of showing us what the motivating factors behind Thibodeau's decisions are. Whether those things are good enough to win a championship is still yet to be seen. But I feel very strongly that these are likely not the optimal decisions in terms of this team reaching its ceiling. And so when you play a team like the Rockets without Şengün and Fred VanVleet, or you play a team like the Raptors, you can make these decisions at the margins that are suboptimal, because this team is so well constructed and so good, it can still be good enough. Benji Ritholtz posted the other day, like, the starting lineup with Deuce versus the starting lineup with Precious, and the Deuce lineup is the best, but don't forget the Precious lineup is still good too over this same small sample size. And that's true. He's exactly right. The Precious lineup has performed well. But when you play a team like the Celtics in the playoffs, you can't fall back on, but this lineup's still pretty good. You have to be the best version of yourself. If you're not the best version of yourself, you're not giving yourself the best chance to win. You're probably not going to win. And so I just want to make it clear, XJ and I aren't saying that these teams are going to be bad or that there are no positive merits to any of these teams. But our entire motivation as analysts and as fans, if we're commenting on any team, our goal is to try and figure out what gives these teams the best chance of winning a championship. That is our sole motivating goal. And what we see, or actually you can tell me if I'm wrong, but what I see when I see Thibs making these decisions is somebody not giving his team the best chance of winning a championship, because I assume that he'll have the same motivating factors when the playoffs come. He will always fall back on these safeguards, these things that he values maybe more than he otherwise should. So I know that was a little bit of a rant, but I do think it's extremely relevant, because you have fans that are so happy that the Knicks are good and they're not, what they were from 2004 through 2011, or 2002 to 2011, and then once again 2014 to 2018, and they're just like, man, can we just enjoy a win, a back-to-back wins? Does it matter? And to me, it does matter. To you, it doesn't have to matter. I'm not telling anyone else how to be a fan or how to be an analyst. But to me, as someone who, when I analyze the Knicks, I'm trying to talk about how they can win a championship. I see a team that is built to win a championship that isn't necessarily acting in a manner that gives them the best chance of winning a championship.
Yeah, I think that was perfectly said, honestly. And I think that is like, we'll come on here and kind of talk about things from this macro perspective and talk about things from this perspective of like, what is what they're doing? How is that aligning them with the potential to win an NBA championship this season and beyond? And I think that clashes with a lot of people's in our audience and other folks like that maybe don't watch the show but maybe see clips of it. That clashes with their experience of just like, I just want to enjoy winning. Like the Knicks are winning games. The Knicks have won 7 of 8. The Knicks are one of the best offenses in the league. The Knicks are a title contender. They're on everybody's, like best teams list, everybody's power rankings. This is a unique experience from a Knicks fan perspective of someone who's been a Knicks fan, for the last 20, 30, 40 years. This is a rare occurrence. And I just want to enjoy winning. It's fun. We get to beat up on bad teams. We get to compete with good teams, and that's exciting. And I completely understand that. I think that that's a totally valid perspective, and I understand it feeling like, and then I have these other guys, and they're coming in talking about this is not optimal, and this is not like playing this way is not the most optimal way to potentially win a championship, and there's not enough flexibility in here, and here are these issues around the edges and around the margins. And I can understand that being sort of annoying or off-putting in a way, because it feels like it's putting a dampening on the enjoyment of the present, right? And so, again, to your point, I echo your point. Like, I totally understand that perspective. I think it's totally valid. I hope people enjoy things as a fan in whatever way that they enjoy consuming the game, because that's what it's about at the end of the day. Like, is it bringing you joy? Is it bringing you happiness? And that's why, is it bringing you entertainment? And that's why people watch. For us, in terms of what would bring us the most joy and most entertainment and most happiness from a fan perspective and from an analyst perspective, for any team that we're watching and analyzing, is you could package up all the joy that people experience during the regular season of the wins and the win streak and being a top team. You could package that all up, and I would experience, as a fan, I would experience that in the moment of winning the championship all at once. You could package that all up, and that's when I have all of that. It's all at the same time. To me, that's what my experience is, and that is probably a little too black or white. That's a little too singular, I think, for a lot of people's perspectives. And I think that's okay. But at the same time, recognize that when we're analyzing the game, we are looking at it from that paradigm of what is going to win a championship, what is going to bring this team the most likelihood of actually winning. And that is our analysis. So you can't bring into that, oh, but I'm enjoying the here and now, and say that clashes with the analysis that we're bringing, because it's not about enjoying the here and now. It's about winning that title. It's about getting that highest level goal accomplished. And that is the perspective for me as an analyst, as a fan of any team that I might root for, of any team that I might analyze. That's what I'm thinking about. If they're making trades, if they're tanking, what does this do to their potential chance of winning a championship in X number of years? Not what does it do to their potential chance of being a team that's frisky. Like, I don't, so I think that's ultimately a divide that I noticed, that people feel like we may come across as negative. But I think we're very even keeled. I think we don't get too high or too low, and we try to stick to sort of the fundamentals, so to speak, as I've said in the past, and look at kind of the underlying team, the underlying product, and the potential for that team to win a title. And that's kind of how we evaluate on a week by week basis. And hopefully people who watch this pod appreciate that. And even if they don't agree with it, they get some value from it in terms of having this kind of concrete sort of best attempt at an objective analysis of doing that.
Yeah, that was just perfectly said. I'd say again, you force me into the old school box every week. I just feel like that was perfect. Like that was just, I have no response. I too obviously hope that the people who listen to us, even if they don't agree, can at least understand our perspective, because that is the foundation of good discourse, and we've noticed that so often in it growing amongst the people who listen to us and want to share their perspectives, is they're sharing them more and more with an open mind and with a form of respect. Like, yeah, I hear what you're saying here, but I don't necessarily agree. Here's what I think, and it makes it easier for us to get on, not get on your level. That sounds condescending, but like to put ourselves in the minds of other people.
To
It's
empathize.
really hard,
Yeah.
and to empathize. Yeah, perfect word, because it's just going to be a lot harder if people come in and they're like, you're stupid or you're just a hater. Like, I hope it's clear by now that we're not being haters for haters' sake. We just have this goal in mind, and that's how we're always analyzing things. And look, the Hart Precious Huck Party lineup is its own animal. At the end of the day, it's 20 possessions. So, and I do think that those 20 possessions were pretty, not just damning in terms of that lineup's potential, but also pretty harmful to the team's win probabilities, as we saw in those two games. But I do think that the Deuce versus Precious thing is actually is a lot more interesting, for the reason that I think Precious has merits that are completely different to the merits Deuce brings, and it's close enough that I think we should be able to have an open-minded conversation where both sides bring the positives to each perspective. I do think it's a lot closer, and I always try to be cognizant of that because I feel very strongly that Deuce should be in the starting lineup for rotation reasons and for giving the team the highest ceiling. But it is a lot closer than I think somebody might think that I believe just from the words I say. You know what I'm saying? I come off so strongly one-sided that sometimes I have to recognize that I'm not fully giving credence to the other side, and that's just an improvement I have to make as a person and as an analyst.
Yeah, it's a good point to raise because I generally agree with you. I think that it's closer than maybe it comes off as from both of us sometimes, and I think that is oftentimes due to some of the polarizing nature of like being on social media and like kind of having a position and you're arguing with someone else, and that's how it comes off. But to me, I've expressed this to you, and we actually disagree on a particular point about this, but I think the merits of Deuce versus Precious, as long as Hart is in the lineup, is much closer than probably people would think that I would think it is. And that's because I don't think there's like such a significant difference between having 3 really good to great shooters and 2 either poor to non-shooters, and 4 really good to great shooters and 1 poor to non-shooter. To me, that difference can be made up in a lot of ways. There's a lot of things that go into that, because I don't think that the ceiling of a 4+1, so to speak. When I say 4+1, I don't mean a 4+1 alignment. I mean 4 shooters and 1 poor non-shooter. The ceiling of that is what it is. I think but the ceiling of a 5+0, 5 good to great shooters on the court at all times, I think the ceiling of that is so significant that to me, I don't think it's close. I don't think 4 good shooters and 1 non-shooter, or 3 good shooters and 2 non or poor shooters is anywhere near the potential or the ceiling of a 5 really good shooters on the court at all times. It's not close to me. To me, I will take a very strong stance on that, and that's why I think Deuce is a better player to be in the starting lineup than Josh Hart, even though currently Josh Hart is a better player than Deuce McBride. But
can I ask you? I just want to, because I feel differently. So I'm not going to push back here. I just want to understand your point further and help the audience understand your point further. So 2 questions. One is a clarifying question. To simplify, you think that if you were to isolate the pure impact of shooting on a team's offense, that there is a smaller impact difference between a 3+2 and a 4+1, and a 4+1 versus a 5+0?
Yes, you could. I think you could describe it that way. Yeah.
Okay. You think that the difference in the impact of shooting is greater between 4+1 and 5+0 than 3+2 and 4+1?
Yeah. If I'm understanding your framing, yeah, I think you could say that. Yeah.
Okay. Second question. Does this mean one of your favorite teams in the league, the Oklahoma City Thunder. Does this mean that you think there is a meaningful difference between, say, a lineup of SGA, Caruso, Isaiah Joe, Jalen Williams, and Chet Holmgren versus the first four and Isaiah Hartenstein?
Yes. Yeah.
You think it's just the ceiling of the first lineup is just massively greater than the
Absolutely.
ceiling of the.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's a great example actually, because and of course our goal when we're talking is always to like understand each other's perspectives, potentially grow our own perspectives by hearing the other person's perspectives, all of that stuff. Hopefully the same goals that our audience has from engaging with us when they leave comments, when we interact with them, all of that stuff. One way you could go with that is like using a fifth player interchanging with the shooter and having that fifth player be like much worse, and just say like, well, if I take out Hartenstein and I put in a much worse player who's a better shooter, do you think it'd still be better? And honestly, it depends on how much worse that player is, but most likely not, because Hartenstein's such a great defensive player. Like that's a huge blow, and you would need to have at least like a good player who is also able to shoot well. Chet Holmgren is the perfect embodiment of that. Chet Holmgren provides the defense that Isaiah Hartenstein does, not the rebounding, but the defense that he does, and is also obviously a markedly better shooter. And I think that for this iteration of the Thunder, with the Shai Gilgeous-Alexander that we've seen, the way that they've performed without Hartenstein, with literally no center, with Jalen Williams, J-Dub playing as the center, or with guys like Kenrich Williams playing as the center, and how they've been able to perform, I think that the difference in talent is pretty significant, but the difference is made up in the kind of underlying compounding positive effects that you get from just having five shooters on the court at all times. The spacing is unbelievable. You can to double team, to help, to stunt and recover is so much more difficult when you have guys who are capable of shooting from at every position on the court. And you can play both alignments. You can play a 5-out alignment. You can play a 4+1 alignment. You can have a guy roaming in the dunker spot. It's just much better if that guy roaming in the dunker spot also is able to shoot potentially. So to me, it's just there's so many sort of like intangible benefits that are compounding upon each other that I think that it's a great example that you gave. And I do think that the Chet Holmgren version of that same lineup has a significantly higher ceiling. And in a playoff dynamic, it'll be really interesting what the Thunder do. And I think we may end up just seeing like Hartenstein play much less than we probably would imagine he would.
So I'm going to cheat a little bit here, and I'm going to switch Hartenstein to Zubats. And I'm going to do that because I actually think Hartenstein provides a form of gravity that most other non-shooting centers don't, with his passing at the top of the key.
That's
and
true.
Just if you drop too far off him, he'll just dribble into a handoff and screen and create a three. My basic perspective, and we can just put a bow on this and move on to the rest of the Knicks discourse, is that if you replaced Isaiah Joe in that lineup that we just described with a non-shooting wing like Dyson Daniels or something, if you replace Isaiah Joe with Dyson Daniels and Holmgren with Zubats, that the difference between that lineup and the 4+1 with Zubats and Joe in for Dyson Daniels would be way wider than the difference between the 4+1 with Zubats at center and Chet Holmgren at center. I know it's just a specific example, so that doesn't have to mean that I'm right about the macro point of it, but I'm using it as an example to try and frame what I believe. I just think that a 3+2 is so harmful to spacing. Every single team defense, when you're in a scramble, all 30 teams in this day and age are starting with the non-shooter as the way to patch up the defense. That's what they're doing. They're first of all, he's the first. If you're a well-coached team, he's the first player you're helping off of, and the whole goal is to funnel the ball to that player. Now, obviously, we've seen it with like Josh Hart. There are ways to counteract that. There's cutting. There's really good ball movement. I'm not saying this is a perfect defense. I'm just saying that this is the number one way to counteract a disadvantageous situation as a defense when you're in a scramble. That is way easier in a 3+2. And I think that, to the point that I just brought up, as a 4+1, you have to be so perfect in a scramble. And it's really, really hard to do it perfectly. And even if you do it perfectly, it's still exploitable by the non-shooter. Like I said, there are ways to get it. I just don't think, I think, honestly, at the highest level, I almost think a 3+2 is like a non-starter. I just think it's way too exploitable.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think there's, and this is probably my last thought on this, and we'll definitely, I'm sure this will come up later in the season too. Um, so I think that what you're describing, and the reason why I don't necessarily agree, two things. So one, there's a difference, a major, major, major difference between a playoff context and a regular season context. Like in a regular season, teams are not necessarily completely altering their defensive schemes and approaches on a game, on a night by night basis, a game to game basis. So I think that you can get by with, the Knicks got by with Precious Achiuwa, in a double big lineup in a lot of cases. Precious at the 4 last season before they started getting exploited, because teams were just not treating it in that way. Teams like, for instance, one of the key or core tenets of defense is that you don't help off the strong side corner. And that is true unless the player in the strong side corner just has no hope in the world of making the shot, in which case it would make sense to help off the strong side corner. But most times teams' defenses are not going to alter their approaches on a night by night basis to that extent. They're going to just rely on sort of their core principles. So there's a huge difference between a playoff context and a regular season context. I think 3+2 is more damaging in a playoff context when a team can just focus in and say, wait, who are you playing on the court? Okay, we can totally game plan around this. Secondly, the reason why I think the difference is not as immense is because the 4+1 is sort of like a middle ground. It's like, we're not maxed out with our spacing, we're not maxed out with our defense and with our rebounding. We're sort of trying to play the fence in the middle. I think if you are having this situation, it's just a situation of 3 shooters and 2 non. It's just an entirely different type of basketball. Your approach is entirely different. It's not like we're sort of trying to do both. We're doing one thing, and one thing we're doing is we're getting every offensive rebound, every defensive rebound. You're not going to score. We're able to play a completely different style of basketball. And to me, there are so many benefits to being able to go all in with that, to double down with that approach, that helps to make up some of the difference in terms of ideal basketball. When you talk to about 4 shooters and 1 non, or 3 shooters and 2 non, it helps make up some of that divide such that the gap is not as significant as it should be based on what you described, which I agree with you. It's so much easier to deal with from a rotation standpoint. I think it makes up some of that difference with the difficulty that you're going to have fighting for rebounds. You'll have less transition opportunities because you have to bring more people to defensive rebound, less easy opportunities to score. The defense is going to be better. You have huge guys sucking up rebounds constantly. We're talking about, even in this case, Karl-Anthony Towns, the best defensive rebounder in the NBA, or maybe a Sabonis, and then another guy next to him, Precious, who is like an elite defensive rebounder as well. It just is a different kind of basketball, in my opinion, which changes the dynamics.
Yeah, you're definitely right, and I think you make a great point. Almost the point that, not that you've changed my perspective, but I think you've altered it, and I want to clarify it. Similar to what we were talking about earlier in this episode, I'm all about championship ceiling. And I think my greater point is that I think that a team with a 4+1 that does deploy that sort of half measure can have a championship ceiling, and maybe even like a high percentile championship ceiling. I think, for whatever the reasons, you can get away with it in certain contexts. We saw the Nuggets do it in 2023 with Aaron Gordon at power forward. I am extremely skeptical at a team deploying 2 non-shooters, even if fully optimized, even if embracing the non-shooting aspects of their game. I'm skeptical that in 2025 they can win at the highest level. I think they have a very, very low percentile chance. And, we can bring this back to the Knicks. I'd be very skeptical at their chances of winning a championship going through an entire playoff run with Mitchell Robinson playing big minutes, unless that means that Josh Hart either, 1, starts shooting a lot more and more accurately, or 2, he's the one whose minutes get Mitchell Robinson, he's the one whose minutes get swapped out for, and they're still playing a lot of 4+1, but it's with Deuce and Bridges and OG Anunoby and Jalen Brunson and Karl-Anthony Towns. But if the plan is we just like this size and we're going to play Mitchell Robinson 25, 30 minutes a game, and Josh Hart's still playing his 37 to 40 minutes a game, I think that significantly would reduce the ceiling. And I just think it would be really, really hard to win a championship that way. So to me, when I say a 4+1 is closer to a 5+0 from a ceiling perspective, I think that's what I mean. I think a 4+1 can approach, from a championship EV perspective, it can approach a 5+0, whereas I just don't think a 3+2 is even close.
I think that's a great distinction, and I think we're probably closer than with that context. The one thing I'll add to it before moving forward is that it definitely matters whether the second player is a complete non-shooter, like will not attempt threes, and is like a Josh Hart, like a bad shooter, sort of like, I think people may not realize, but Josh Hart over his last 20 games is shooting 26% from three, after a very, very hot start early in the season. So he's still shooting 34% from three, but he's shooting 26% in the last 20 games. That's really bad. And I think, I'm a believer in regression to the mean. I think it makes sense that he would start out really hot and then end up extremely cold. And neither of them are him. Who he is probably what his season average is, which is around 34%. I think that's probably who he is as a shooter, 32, 33, 34%. So if we're talking about Josh Hart, I think that makes a significant difference either way versus we're talking about, let's say, cloning Precious Achua. We're not going to clone theory, folks. Don't worry. But if we're talking about two Precious and or Josh Hart and a Precious, or a Josh Hart and a Mitchell Robinson, I think that does make a difference. So, and you made that distinction with Isaiah Hartenstein too, with being not just like a pure, the same thing as when you say non-shooting big, you don't necessarily mean Isaiah Hartenstein, and that's probably why they were able to have some success with like Hartenstein and Precious Achua together last year. But yeah, so that's the only distinction I would make. But these are great points.
It is a really interesting thought experiment because we brought this up with Amen Thompson earlier when we talked about him, or maybe we brought it up on the side when we thought we were going to talk about him. Regardless, Josh Hart is probably one of, if not the best non-shooting wings in the entire NBA. Like if you were going to pair Josh Hart with a non-shooting big, or excuse me, if you were going to pair a non-shooting wing with a non-shooting big and try to win a championship, Josh Hart is exactly who you would try that experiment with. Like, if it can't work with Josh Hart, it can't work, in my opinion. Would you agree with that?
No, I would take Amen Thompson over Josh Hart, but yeah.
Amen Thompson is his own thing. Okay, but like Josh Hart is one of the handful of guys you would select for this type of.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. All right, well, in the interest of breaking the fourth wall, like I think we should probably kind of end it there so that we don't go over like an hour-long episode. You guys don't like when you see the 100 at the end of it for some reason, but I think this was a really good conversation. So I'm really happy with this episode, and hopefully, we've been able to kind of connect with our audience a little bit deeper, even, with just like kind of understand, like trying to share our perspective a little bit in more detail, and sharing that we also understand the differing perspectives a little bit more. So if you would like to leave a comment, disagree, agree, we had a lot of sort of like debates, but obviously they were more about like trying to expand our perspectives. Go ahead and drop a comment. We respond to every single comment. We love engaging, and that's what we're trying to do here at High Hand Theory, expand our perspectives and engage with everybody who watches. Any last words, Geoff?
No, yeah, just we appreciate everyone who listened, and I think the thing I'm most proud of that I'm learning each week is that the people who like our content really like it, and that's so reassuring. But also, I mean, XJ and I, when we started this thing, we were like, we don't know who's going to listen, but we just knew that we enjoyed talking basketball together, and we not just, we don't always agree, but we do, from the most general standpoint, have similar ways of looking at the game, even if it doesn't always lead to the same conclusions. And so we were just, we were going to be happy just getting on here and talking to each other and seeing what happened, and seeing so many other people who, agree, disagree, but are just like, we appreciate this new perspective. Yeah, that's just so reassuring, and it's one of the major thing that drives us each week. So just appreciate you all for all the nice things you say and that you keep coming back.
I definitely echo that. Well said, Geoff. Well heard by me and well heard by our audience. We will see you next time. I think we're going to have a trade deadline episode that we haven't recorded yet, so we'll hopefully drop that soon. If we do, then please watch that. Otherwise, we'll see you next week. And this has been Hot Hand Theory.